welcome. We're gathered here today because Betty Mills has died. This was not a tragic death that came too soon. Betty had her full measure and lived so well. Still, having Betty in our circle made our lives so much richer. And so we gather to be sad together and to celebrate her amazing life, each of us holding a piece of her story. So I'm the Reverend Elizabeth Soley, and I was the interim minister at the Bismarck, Mandan Unitarian Universalist Fellowship several years ago. And when in one of our last conversations, Betty said to me, "You will be my last minister." So when Betty's family called to ask if I would participate in Betty's service today, I was relieved. It feels fitting that Betty's last minister should be here to honor her today, especially when she gave so much to her congregation. So I am grateful to be here. Betty's family also feels gratitude that you are all here to share in this special time with them today. Thank you for coming. It is so good to be together. Over the years, Betty herself did many memorial services for friends. Her family asked that we weave some of the words she wrote into this service, believing as they do that it is hard to improve upon perfection. So in Betty's own words, we gather here today to count the ways, to express our love and appreciation for this most remarkable woman, to her family, to each other, to celebrate her life and to be grateful that we have shared some part of her life with her. At such times, the various faiths which sustain us separately come together in a harmony which acts across all creeds and assures us of the permanence of goodness, the inspiration of dedication, the value of a serviceable life. May these moments together be filled with memories of a friend, of someone we loved, who only such a short time ago walked with us, blessing us with her presence, and in departing leaves us saddened, but uplifted in spirit, for the tribute we must pay, however inadequate, is to give Betty the great gift of remembering, not that she is dead, but that she has lived. Carol Jean, you want to come up? In Betty's faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism, we begin our services by lighting a chalice. And the chalice is a symbol of light, of love, and of deep wisdom. When we kindle the flame, we are acknowledging we are entering into sacred space, space that is made holy by our love. We kindle our flame this morning, knowing that the spark of one life can spread light and warmth to so many others. We light our chalice this morning in deep gratitude to be touched by just such a life. So Betty once wrote, "What can be said of death, except that nothing can be said? After 10,000 years of death, we do not talk about it, we weep. But of our dead, of them, we have much to say. It would be mean and contemptible to cast them into the ground or fire without a backward glance, as if they were only some leaf falling off an autumn tree." The Harvard anthropologist asked the African bushman why he stayed near his dead. The bushman answered quietly, "He is our person, whom we love." Civilization has no better reply. Confronted by death, driven to sorrow, mute silence is not an adequate response to this event. Our lives are lived in and sustained by a universe of human discourse, a world which we have together spoken into existence. That fragile world, a web woven of tales and songs, of silences shared, of words whispered softly in the night, of hope and pain remembered, has been broken by death. And we cannot restore it unless we speak of this woman who bound us together in a community of relationship. It is necessary that the silence be broken by the frail human voice. A woman's voice may be stilled, but her good words evermore us daring adventure and eager sharing. All that came from deep within her heart is secure in the hearts of her loved ones and good friends. It is well for us to speak of those qualities which we treasured in Betty.
Spanning over 60 years, Betty's service to her community started when she was 25 as part of a group who formed the Bismarck chapter of the North Dakota League of Women Voters. And at the ripe age of 80, she was still going strong as part of the Alternatives to Violence project, where she counseled inmates at the state penitentiary. I remember asking Sherry one day, "What's your mom up to this weekend?" And she simply looked at me and said, "She's at the pen." For you see, by the time Betty was in her 80s, the family simply assumed that she was leading the charge on some issue or working with some group to make the world a better place. In almost every group she belonged to, she had a leadership position at one time or another. And her energy seemed endless, examining and seeking answers and solutions to the pressing issues of the day, everything from clarifying voting procedures to trying to get the state legislature to form a human rights commission. She was recognized for her dedication to public service by many groups, including Mary College, where she was the first person to receive its Distinguished Service Award. In her soft-spoken manner, she encouraged others to use their own words. Whether at the local, state, or national level, she not only made her voice be heard, but served as a role model for others of all ages, showing them through her actions the importance of having their voice be heard. As Heidi Heidkamp wrote in a birthday letter, I have to smile because I told Heidi I couldn't read her writing, so I just made some of this up. A few women who inspired me to be real and true to who I am, and you are in that group. You are the gift that gave North Dakota women the courage to have a voice. You will never be forgotten because every time we raise our voices to be heard, your voice will be heard as well. She used the tremendous power of the pen to address issues of the day for some 20 years through her weekly columns in the Bismarck Tribune, addressing everything from politics to gun violence and gun control, gays in the military, education standards, required reading in schools and book banning, welfare reform, domestic violence, campaign reform, and so many other issues. Her columns sparked debate, and I dare say provided not only community leaders, but also the general public with an opportunity to read both sides of an issue, as it seemed that at least once a week, someone opposed Betty's conclusions and sent a letter to the editor. She encouraged one of the most important components of democracy, that being debate. A wise person once wrote, "Leadership is not about getting your way. It's about encouraging honest discourse and finding common ground." That is what Betty did by way of her columns. It should come as no surprise that Betty's dedication to community service infected her children, whether by serving as a chair of a drug and alcohol task force, counseling individuals with mental health issues at a drop-in clinic, serving as president of a statewide organization, being active in local service clubs and nonprofit organizations, and as was so important to Betty, participating in their kids' school activities. The children of Betty Mills made her proud. And now we see her dedication to community service come to life in her beloved grandchildren. As they follow her footsteps, whether it's working with autistic kids, spending time with the God's Child's Project in Guatemala, or being elected to a school board, we can all rest assured that her legacy of service is in good hands. In closing, I would like to use Betty's own words from a column she submitted to the Bismarck Tribune in 1984 when the Tribune was looking for new opinion writers. The following is the ending to her winning column entitled, "I would be proud to be accused of being a do-gooder." And I quote, "We're not convinced we can save the world or even our corner of it, but we're positive we'll lose if we don't try. We took John Kennedy seriously when he asked what we had done for our country, and we intend to continue. So I don't care if you call me a do-gooder. It is an honorable title, and I shall so wear it. Thank you, Betty.
So the Bismarck Mandan Unitarian Fellowship officially incorporated in 1952. In the community, the fellowship, which now has an even longer name, is simply referred to as the UU. And Betty Mills was one of its founders. She would have been about 26 years old when they got their articles of incorporation. And she would continue to be an integral part of the fellowship for the next 7 decades. Eventually, a piece of land was donated, and Betty and her husband Bill, along with 2 other couples, took out a second mortgage on their homes to make a building possible. Amongst other things, Betty taught Sunday school, and she had 3 wild little boys, Kent, Cliff, and Frank, who definitely challenged her. They all grew into men who achieved a lot in their fields, and Kent reflected that they were lucky to have her as a Sunday school teacher, and later as a friend. It became a tradition that Betty would, at the very least, preach the opening and closing sermon of the church year. But she didn't just preach in her own congregation. She was in demand around the country. And during the civil rights era, the faith had its own unrest. At an annual business meeting, the association promised $1 million to fund the Black Caucus. Shortly after that, the association realized they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And not only could they not fund the Black Caucus, but they had to dramatically slash the budget and lay off people as well. And it was during this tumultuous time that Betty served on our national board. She had a lot of stories about what the young woman from North Dakota brought to that board. Because of Betty's national connections, the small fellowship attracted notable guest speakers and visitors. Later, she also served on the more local Prairie Star District Board. Betty was a writer as well, and she began a dialogue with a Catholic columnist. The 2 women would go on to write a book together called Mind If I Differ, a Catholic Unitarian Dialogue. Those are a few of Betty's highlights, and I could keep going. But when I reached out to her fellow congregants, that isn't what they were focused on. Instead, they wanted to talk about the way that Betty lived her religion. She was fearless. She coined the phrase, the little church with the big mouth. She had a fierce intellect and was exceptionally articulate. She used her intellect to build bridges and to explore meaning. She wanted to know what connects us as human beings. Even those who disagreed with her had a deep respect for her. She had a sparkle in her eye, even in her 90s, and that sparkle seemed to emanate from her deep joy in being alive. Betty was not a person who watched from the sidelines, but rather a person who was all in. I don't know that I have ever met a person who was more alive. Her wit and her wonderful sense of humor were treasured, and she was always a calm anchor in the congregation. Betty was a lifelong learner. She read voraciously, and she loved good conversation. And she was willing to be changed by what she read, which is rare. A few years ago, she read a book about the ghost dance. She was fascinated to compare what she had learned as the descendant of early white settlers with stories of Indian encounters to what she was reading from an indigenous point of view. She was so curious and so open. In her last years, Betty was looking back. She reflected a lot on the advantages she had had early in her life that her schoolmates did not. She was humbled and grateful for all that she was given in life. Her father's early death changed the trajectory of her life, but rather than grow defeated or bitter, Betty threw herself into her family, her church, and her community with the full weight of her enthusiasm, intellect, and compassion. She also reflected a lot on her father's way of being in the world. The little book of Emerson that was always in his shirt pocket, his thoughtful nature, and his reputation in the community as the man to turn to when you needed help. Betty concluded that it was her father who had taught her to be a Unitarian. Some of Betty's dearest friendships came out of the fellowship. One in particular stands out. Betty's was friends with another founder, Joyce Conrad. Joyce, another staunch UU, left Bismarck for a time. Near the end of her life, Joyce moved back to Bismarck to be near family, but also to be near Betty. Finally, people talked about how Betty made them feel. She would light up when she saw you. She made you feel special, like you mattered. Betty was one of those rare people who actually lived her faith. She lives a hole in our hearts and a guide for how to live well.
Many people have grandmothers who bake cookies and cook Christmas dinners and taught them to sew, garden, watch birds, sing. My grandmother, Betty Mills, or Muti to the family, taught me how to speak to chickadees and tame wild cats. She did traditional grandmother things, but considering she was an unconventional soul, they were often done with her own twist, and always with love. She valued tradition, and when there was one missing, she built it. Take, for example, Christmas Eve dinner, comprised of crab and spaghetti, a tradition that began as a newlywed and expanded with her young children. Because the chef had spent time working hard to make this fine meal, Muti required nice clothing. So still today, every Christmas Eve, dressed ready for a feast, we gather at the table, say grace, roll up our sleeves, don aprons, and eat saucy crab with our hands. It was a tradition done her way, with laughter and joy. That's how she approached the world, seeing a gap, then filling it with laughter and joy, all while bringing people together and making everyone welcome. In photographs of my grandmother, there was a consistent theme of love and care. She was always loving on someone or something. Like the picture of her at about 9, sitting with a lap full of kittens on the family farm. Man, she loved kittens. Always. She was always taking care of kittens at various times of her life, taking care of the threshing with her dad, taking care of family, siblings, cousins, neighbors, children, their friends, her friends, grandchildren. Her love and care was threaded into her being, ultimately becoming what held her family together. A few months ago, she pointed to a framed hanging on the wall. It was 4 squares, containing a photograph of each of her children. She looked at it and said, "Don't you love that quilt?" My quilt. She said, my quilt. And I do love that quilt. And she loved that quilt. And the people in those squares, and all the squares they in turn sewed, creating a family that she could wrap her arms around and that would surround her with love in return. She was most beloved by all of us. And like any handmade quilt, family requires care. Not just caregiving, but care. She made magical cookies, pancakes, and cabin corn, the kind of food you could always taste the love in. She was a ruthless Monopoly player, never once letting her grandchildren or great nieces and nephew win. When my mother asked her about this tactic, softly suggesting letting us win might be okay, Muti replied, "Oh, Sherry, how will they ever learn?" You know, that might have been part of it. A woman like that doesn't accomplish as much as she did without some tenacity and a drive to win. Even in games, she cared about winning. One of the greatest ways she showed her caring was through words. There isn't a child or grandchild, niece or nephew, or bonus added family member who doesn't have a memory of her reading with them. She made room for reading. Other things could fall by the wayside to make room for her knowledge, curiosity, and books. She instilled the love of the written word in all of us and showed us how to make space for it. One of my favorite stories of her was surrounding my Uncle Willie when he was maybe 7. He'd been marveling over ants and had quite a few questions. My grandmother let him know that they could go to the library and find books about those hard-working creatures. Later that day, little Willie was staring at Muti as she made dinner. She asked what he was doing, and he replied, "I thought we were going to the library to learn about ants." And with that, the apron came off, dinner was delayed, and an adventure to the library to collect books about ants, and probably a few others. I seriously believe she rarely left the library without hitting her book limit. Words, books, and education were important to that farm kid. She had limited access to books and would read and reread whatever was available in her one-room school. She cherished education and had quite the learning moment when she started college at the University of Minnesota. Her new friend invited her to a symphony, and as they sat in their seats and the orchestra began, she was baffled by the horrible mismatched music being made, until she realized they were tuning their instruments. But as a rural child, she didn't have exposure to that type of music. In true Muti fashion, she saw the opportunity to help and dove in, becoming a driving force for public broadcasting in North Dakota. She wanted everyone to have a chance to know the sound of orchestral music, what was happening in the world, and who Big Bird was. She brought words and educations everywhere, filling public and personal libraries with books. She once told me she never understood houses without books. Finding room for all of her books was more of her challenge. But beyond filling shelves with books, she filled her family's lives with them. As mother and grandmother, we all spent time with her reading to us and with us, a shared experience as well as cherished time. Sometimes one-on-one and sometimes piled around her as she read. 6 or 7 kids surrounding her on the couch at the cabin as she read stories about trolls and magic and adventure. As children, my brother and I were not skilled readers. She saw an opportunity to help, so she did. Once a week, she met with us after school and we read. Charlie read Shakespeare, I read Little Women, a favorite of hers when she was my age. Together, Muti and I experienced the joy of the March Girls and stories centered around women growing up to do what they wanted, despite what the world was telling them. Honestly, Muti and Marmee have a lot in common. Muti gave me that time, not only because she wanted to help, but because we could share that special space together. In those moments on Wednesday afternoon, while my peers were attending church school, I was learning about feisty girls and becoming the center of my grandmother's very busy world. Centering people in a moment was one of Muti's greatest gifts. Anyone she was speaking with felt like the only person in the room. She seemed to have the ability to stop the world just for you. She would make you everything. She was willing to listen and engage and meet you where you were, without judgment. She didn't react with anger or disapproval, but with kindness and understanding. Her gentle words, accompanied by her reaching out with her gentle, wonderful farm girl hands. The rest of the world faded away. For that time, you were her favorite. She did that with her children and their friends, her grandchildren and our friends, and individuals she met along the way. She could shine a light and center us. Just like the ants, dinner be damned, there was something more important to do. Teacher, listener, guide, confidant, do-gooder, writer, gardener, chef, mother, grandmother, aunt, friend. In one word, Muti. In her final months, Muti shared a lot of lessons from cut your hair to put a sign on the door that reads, no praise needed. The greatest lessons she shared were not through words, but actions. Listen without judgment, meet people where they are, do the work to make the changes, and surround yourself with books. I love you, Muti. Go now in peace.
I want everyone who wants a turn to have a chance to speak, and because we don't want this to turn into a 6-hour memorial service, I'm going to ask you to keep your sharing very brief. If you feel a hand on your shoulder, that will be your gentle reminder to make room for others to speak. And there will be time in the reception and in the days ahead for longer stories. We will, after all, be remembering Betty until somebody is remembering us. Would someone like to come up and start the sharing?
I didn't know Betty for much of her life, I think 10%. And everyone at the UU knows I'm a crier, so they're not surprised. Betty would be giving me a look of disdain. Pull it together, Liz. Okay. I love Betty for the time I knew her, and she created a space in Bismarck that accepted me and my kid and many others. We did a service for her a few years ago, and the sentiment among the younger folk was that her creation of that fellowship saved lives, literally. It gave people a place in an unwelcoming area to come and be loved and be just treated as a human. And when I got there, I knew it was the first church I ever went to of my own volition, and I'm still here 15 years later. So I'm so grateful for Betty. We would go have lunch, and she was always more curious about me and would always ask me questions more than I would ask her. So it's a whole. It's not the whole the family feels, but this is a woman who has had an impactful life. I mean, what a gift to have known her.
Some of you know me, and I can be brief. I have stories about Carol Jean from our trip to Africa. If you want to hear them at the Fellowship afterward, you'll have to pay me. Okay. I got to know Betty through her writing. I used to read her column faithfully, and I loved calling her up in the morning after reading the column and say, I would kind of act like this angry guy, and I said, I can't believe what you wrote in that paper today. How could you say that? I loved every word you said. You know, I couldn't keep this guys up for very long, but I really appreciated her. We had a lot of dialogues over the phone. We had long phone conversations, and I treasure those memories with her. And we kind of talk about how she's kind of left, but, you know, she's still here. You're all here, and she's a part of you. So that's all I have to say. I just treasure my memories. By the way, I'm a retired United Methodist pastor, and our son and his wife are part of the Unitarian. Josh and Laura, you know them? Do they come once in a while? Okay.
Betty knew how to get anyone in the room to break character and step into warmth. She was full of dignity and had no room for pretension. And as an 80-year-old who was the first person to get my pronouns right, she hopelessly ruined me on ideas about what previous generations ought to do. And she taught me and helped guide me that love and listening are as important to activism as making noise. And I'll always be grateful to her for that. And I'll always remember that on the very last day I saw her, only a couple months ago. It was the day before, the last day I saw her. She told me, when you come tomorrow, you should come prepared with a book you're ready to talk about. And we sat there with her, half falling asleep on the newspaper, talking about books, going home to piles and piles in front of every bookshelf. Thank you. Thank you for carrying a piece of her in your hearts.
There are so many faces out there that are beloved to me because of our shared love of books. And Betty, getting to know Betty through the books that she recommended, that we all read together, and getting so much insight. Our group was called the Blue Stockings. And members came and went over the years, but Betty was an enduring presence. And what she gave us, being 20 years everybody's senior, was a perspective we never would have gotten otherwise about going off to college in the in the 1940s, when many of us weren't born yet. But yet she made all of her experiences real and rich and a kind of lesson to us all. I lost my dad the last year before I graduated from college, and I went to a one-room schoolhouse. And I was the last of my generation to do that, but it was commonplace for Betty's generation. And it gave me a bond with her. But as you all know, I felt really special. And so did all of you, because Betty made you feel that way. So I am so grateful to her for her leadership and for supporting causes that I too truly believe in, and doing it with such grace and good cheer, goodwill, and eloquence. She was really a force of nature, and I am just honored to have been able to spend a few hours every month for almost 30 years with her through our book club. She was amazing. We'll miss her.
Just to make the record clear, I am still reading books about ants.
As many people as you see here today, I want you to know that there are others who are watching the service. Many of them are from Touchmark. They work there or they live there. And a few of them aren't at either service because they're taking care of other people and carrying on that legacy as well. And so I just want you to know there are more. And on a personal level, well, everything everybody else said. And then, and one of the things, I got to see her practically a couple of times a day in the last couple of months because I changed jobs and it made it possible, and I was so thankful for that. But one of the last times that I got to visit with her, several of times, her whole, the thing that she wanted to express the most, she just kept saying, we have to take care of the children. The children were her focus, not just hers, everybody's. And again, thankful for that, for being able to be a part of that and to give her a little bit of the love that she gave me.
Now, I'm going to try to follow up my sister, but I'm going to fail miserably at this. For those of you that knew her, let me begin by saying thank you for being here. But I don't think any discussion with my grandmother would be complete without some discussion of her father, for those that knew her. And there's a story of her father that she told me that I think encapsulates her in such a way. She was a young girl, and her father was a thresher. And he would go out on the threshing crews to all the fields, all these farms, and they'd be out on the work. And every time she would go out with him, and every time he would always find the youngest child at the farmer's home. And he would make sure to make that child the most important person on his team for the rest of the day, to lift up that child and make that child the center of the universe. And that stuck with her. That formed the core of her and who she was, because every time she would find the youngest child and lift them up and make them the center of the universe.
I agree, Sherry. I've been lucky enough to know Betty for half a century and several of her children really well. And since Katie and Charlie were about, as a matter of fact, from daycare, when Charlie would get up from his nap, I would walk around the back of the house and he was standing in the window. And his grandma thought that was just fine, that Charlie was up from his nap. I think the story that I've tried to learn from Betty, but it hasn't stuck very well, is I was involved in a book situation about 30 years ago, and Betty was a big advocate on the side of children should be able to read all books, not just ants, but other books as well. And so Betty was in a spirited discussion with someone from the other side, and she just would talk back and forth, and I was sitting beside Betty, and she finally said to him, I guess we have to agree to disagree. So that is the lesson I've tried to learn from Betty, instead of that I should talk louder. So I've tried, and I will keep trying, but she was such an extraordinary woman with some pretty extraordinary relatives. We'll never forget her.
I have just a couple short Betty stories. Her daughter Randy and I are the same age. And when we were in maybe 7th or 8th grade, Randy said, my mom won't let me wrap my hair. And that's sort of like back comb, you know. I said, why? And she said, because she said if I do, I'd look like a pea shooter with an atom bomb on top. I don't know if Randy remembers that, but that's a well-turned phrase, and everybody knows she was the queen of the well-turned phrase. And the second story, I think it was around 2000, my husband and I had a New Year's Eve party, and we invited Bill and Betty. And when I got back to school on Monday, one of my fellow teachers came over and said, Mary, I saw Betty Mills at your party. I said, yeah? Betty Mills was at your party? I said, yeah. So you actually know Betty Mills? And I said, yeah, isn't she just great? Betty Mills. And then she just said, wow, walked away. And that just shows you a small example of the esteem and awe in which she was held in this community. Betty Mills.
I had the good fortune to be a member of one of, I don't know how many book clubs Betty was. The book that one of the predecessors here mentioned was, the title of it was Mind If I Differ. She co-wrote it with a Catholic. We women of a certain age who grew up in North Dakota know what that means. So she wrote it in 1964 because she was curious, and the woman she co-wrote it with us was a Catholic scholar. I read that book. I took it out from the library. It was in tatters. We have 2 copies in the library. I say we because I used to work at the library. We have 2 copies of that in the library right now. It's a fabulous book. One of the copies is in the rare book room. You cannot take it out. The other copy, like I said, is in tatters. We need another copy.
So it's always amazing to me that however well we know someone, there is still more to learn. So thank you for stitching together this beautiful tapestry of Betty's life. So Betty was a lover of poetry and loved a poem by Christina Rossetti. It had a special place in her heart, and a week before she died, she recited it by memory to her family. So I hope you can hear it in her voice. When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me. Plant thou no roses at my head, nor shady cypress tree. Be the green grass above me, with the showers and the dewdrops wet. And if thou wilt, remember, and if thou wilt, forget. I shall not see the shadows, I shall not feel the rain, I shall not hear the nightingale sing on as if in pain. And dreaming through the twilight, that doth not rise nor set. Haply may I remember, and haply may I forget. So as we draw this service to a conclusion, service of remembrance, we want to close with an affirmation of Betty's life that she wrote. To say that a person has died is to speak only a half-truth. There is more to us than the portion which is a prisoner of time. A woman's voice may be stilled, but her words and deeds ever move us. All that came from deep within her heart is secure in the hearts of her loved ones and good friends. Let us tenderly, in our minds and hearts, keep her in whose memory we are gathered here, having in mind the wonder of life and death, cherishing her generous impulses and her good deeds in love, remembering the strong and beautiful meanings of her life. May we go back to the daily round of our duties, more eager to be helpful and kind, as though in the presence of death itself, we had learned to know the deeper meaning of life. May it be so. So please rise in body or spirit and enjoying and singing our closing hymn, Blue Boat Home, and the words are in your bulletin.